A millionaire saves a homeless girl who is crying in the rain. Then he sees something on her stomach that terrifies him. Poole sat motionless in his office chair, the glass skyline of Manhattan stretching endlessly before him. The city's pulse, honking taxis, glittering billboards, and the ceaseless river of headlights offered no solace. It was an impersonal symphony, a blur of activity that he could neither join nor escape. His hands rested on the mahogany desk, fingers absently tracing the grooves in the wood, as if searching for meaning in the emptiness of its texture. The room, pristine and orderly, mirrored his existence. Papers neatly stacked, pens aligned with military precision, every item in its place, but devoid of life. A faint hum from the air conditioning filled the silence, underscoring the hollowness within. Poole leaned back, his gaze falling to a framed photo on the corner of the desk. Charlotte's radiant smile lingered eternally. Beside her, baby Pamela sat with wide, curious eyes, clutching a stuffed rabbit that Poole had impulsively purchased. The memory struck him abruptly and sharply, akin to a shard of glass embedded in an unhealed wound. He picked up the frame and stared, as if the photo could offer answers to questions he'd long stopped asking. 8 years. It was impossible to think about it in any other terms. Time hadn't softened the edges of his grief. It had merely dulled his ability to feel anything else. The crash played out in fragments, vivid yet disjointed. The screech of tires, Charlotte's panicked gasp, the weightless, sickening lurch as the car flipped, and then silence. Poole's fingers tightened around the frame. The doctors had told him Charlotte had died instantly, her body shielding Pamela. But Pamela, his Pamela, had been lost too. That was what they said. The tiny coffin, the condolences from people he barely knew, and the endless blur of empty days afterward had been proof enough. And yet, it had never felt complete. He set the photo back down with deliberate care and rose, pushing the chair back with a soft scrape. The city beckoned below, but not to him. A sharp knock on the door startled him back to the present. "Mr. Rowan," his assistant's voice was clipped, professional. "Your next meeting is in 15 minutes. Poole straightened, the mask of composure slipping seamlessly into place. "Thank you, Leah. I'll head down shortly." The rain had begun to fall by the time Poole reached the corner of 48th and Lexington. Fat droplets spattered against his overcoat, the cold creeping in as he walked. Traffic lights painted the wet pavement in shades of red and green, shimmering like an impressionist's canvas. It was then that he saw her. A girl, no older than 8 or 9, sat hunched under the awning of a shuttered storefront. Her clothes were thin, patched in places, and soaked through. She clutched a small piece of bread, shielding it from the rain as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Poole slowed his pace, his eyes drawn to her, as though some invisible thread connected them. She tore a corner from the bread, her movements slow and deliberate, and handed it to a woman beside her, a frail figure cradling a crying infant. The woman's hands trembled as she took it, her whispered, "Thank you," barely audible over the rain. The girl said nothing. Her face remained impassive, her gaze fixed on the baby, who had quieted slightly. Poole watched as she shifted to shield the mother and child from the rain with her thin frame. Something about her stillness, her quiet resolve, cut through the fog that had enveloped him for years. Poole hesitated. He was just a passerby, wasn't he? A stranger observing the lives of others, disconnected from their struggles. Yet, for reasons he couldn't pinpoint, he felt deeply rooted to the place. The girl's hands trembled as she brought the remaining piece of bread to her own mouth, but she didn't eat it. Instead, she tucked it into the woman's coat, as if ensuring it wouldn't go to waste. The rain dripped from her hair, plastering it to her face, but she didn't seem to notice. Poole stepped forward, his shoes splashing in a puddle. The sound was loud and intrusive, and the girl's head snapped up. Her eyes met his, dark, guarded, and far too knowing for her age. Paul faltered, unsure what to say, unsure why he had stopped in the first place. The woman rose hurriedly, clutching the baby to her chest. "Come on," she murmured, tugging at the girl's arm. The girl obeyed without protest, her small form disappearing into the shadows of the street. Paul stood there, the rain soaking into his coat, staring at the empty spot where she'd been. The image of her lingered, etched into his mind with startling clarity. For the first time in years, something stirred within him, a faint echo of connection, of purpose. But just as quickly, it was gone, leaving behind only the rain and the quiet ache of questions he wasn't ready to face. Paul turned and walked away, though his steps felt heavier than before. The rain came in steady sheets, cold and relentless, transforming the streets of Manhattan into a blur of grey. Paul walked briskly, his umbrella tilted against the wind. The rhythm of his shoes on the wet pavement echoed in his mind, filling the silence he so often carried with him. Around him, people moved with purpose, heads down, chasing after destinations that felt far away. He spotted her just as he reached the corner. The girl yesterday, Janice, sat on the edge of a stoop, her knees pulled tight to her chest, a thin patched jacket barely covering her small frame. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, and her hands were curled into fists, hidden within the sleeves of her oversized coat. The rain had soaked through her clothes, leaving her shivering, but her gaze was steady, fixed somewhere in the distance. Paul paused. He wasn't sure why. For a moment, he told himself to keep walking. He had no reason to stop. He didn't know her, and whatever struggles she carried weren't his to fix. But something, in the way she sat, so still and yet so unyielding, held him there. Her small frame was swallowed by the city's indifference, yet she seemed carved out of it, her presence more defiant than defeated. His hesitation felt endless. A taxi splashed water onto the curb, jolting him back into motion. He turned away, pretending not to notice her. But the image lingered in the edges of his mind. From the stoop, Janice watched him as he passed. He was like the others, briefly curious, but ultimately uninterested. They always looked, then looked away like she was part of the scenery, a forgotten detail. She tightened her grip on her knees, forcing the cold to stay outside her skin. It had been months since she'd run from the orphanage. She could still hear the shouting of the caregivers who had loomed over her bed that last night, their voices sharp and cutting. Words like troublemaker and burden had clung to her long after she slipped into the alley behind the building. The streets were better than that place. Here, she had silence, even if it was laced with hunger and loneliness. She could move where she wanted. She didn't have to answer to anyone. But the rain made everything harder. It soaked her small pile of belongings, what little she had left, and turned the food she scavenged into soggy, tasteless lumps. Today, there had been nothing. Her stomach ached with a hollow intensity she tried not to acknowledge. She thought of her mother sometimes, or someone like her mother. Not her face. She couldn't remember that anymore. But the way her voice used to fill the air, soft and warm like sunlight. There had been a house once, and a bed, and mornings when she'd woken up to the smell of something cooking. Those memories felt like dreams now, distant and unreachable. The man from the corner was back. She hadn't noticed him turn around. He stood a few feet away, holding an umbrella, his expression unreadable. For a second, she thought he might yell at her to leave. Shopkeepers and pedestrians often did. But he just stood there, watching. She sat up straighter, her muscles tense, ready to run if she needed to. "I saw you yesterday," Paul said finally, his voice steady but unsure. Janice didn't reply. Her dark eyes locked onto his face, unblinking. She was assessing him, he realized, in a way most adults wouldn't have noticed. He adjusted his grip on the umbrella, feeling unreasonably self-conscious. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather," he added, as if she didn't already know. Still nothing. He glanced down at her bare, dirty feet, then back to her face. Her gaze didn't waver. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice softer now. The question seemed to break her stillness. Her shoulders shifted, and she blinked once, quickly. Then her chin lifted, and she gave him a look that was more suspicion than curiosity. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a damp wallet. "There's a diner across the street. It's warm, and I can get you something to eat." Her stomach betrayed her with a sharp pang, but she stayed silent. Offers like this came with conditions. Sometimes they were harmless, a conversation, a smile, but other times they weren't. She glanced at the diner, its glowing sign a beacon against the wet night, and then back at the man. His face didn't look cruel. He was waiting, giving her time to decide. Finally she stood, the movement slow and deliberate. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her legs were unsteady beneath her, but she ignored them. Paul nodded and turned toward the diner, holding the door open for her as they entered. The room's warmth swept over her, causing her to hesitate at the threshold, her mistrust still clinging to her like rain on her clothes. "Order whatever you like," he said, gesturing to the counter. He didn't sit down, didn't ask questions, just waited. The rain had only worsened by the time they left the diner. Janice trailed behind Paul, her thin shoulders hunched against the cold. She clutched a small paper bag, the leftovers from the meal he'd insisted she take. The warm food had dulled the gnawing hunger in her belly, but it hadn't melted the tension in her chest. Paul paused at the corner, glancing back at her. "You can't stay out here tonight." His tone was calm, almost casual, but there was no mistaking the firmness behind it. Janice slowed, her grip on the bag tightening. "I'll be fine," she mumbled, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "You're soaked," he said, his gaze lingering on the way her damp clothes clung to her frame. "And it's freezing. Come with me, just for the night." She stared at him, the distance between them heavy with unspoken questions. His face didn't show the kind of kindness that demanded repayment, but she'd learned not to trust appearances. Still, the ache in her limbs and the biting wind were enough to make her hesitate. "Just the night?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. Paul nodded. "Just the night." The apartment was vast, clean and impersonal, its walls painted in muted tones that seemed to absorb the city's noise. The faint hum of the heating system was the only sound as Paul opened the door and gestured for her to step inside. Janice hesitated on the threshold, her wet shoes squeaking against the polished floor. She glanced at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of trickery. When she found none, she stepped inside, her movements careful, like she expected the ground to fall away beneath her. "Take your shoes off," Paul said, hanging his coat by the door. He watched as she kicked off her soggy sneakers, revealing thin socks with holes at the toes. "Wait here," he added, disappearing down the hall. Janice stood awkwardly in the entryway, clutching the paper bag like it might anchor her. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it belonged to someone who didn't know how to fill it. She could see glimpses of other rooms, sleek furniture, neatly stacked books, and a kitchen that gleamed under soft lights. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a waiting room. Paul returned with a towel and a folded sweatshirt. "Dry off with this," he said, handing her the towel. "The sweatshirt should fit well enough." She nodded, taking the items without meeting his eyes. As she wrapped the towel around her shoulders, she caught sight of a framed photo on the wall behind him. It showed a woman with soft, warm features holding a baby. The woman's smile was radiant, but something about her eyes made Janice stop. There was a depth there, a quiet strength that felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. "Come on," Paul said, drawing her attention back. "You can sit in the living room." Janice perched on the edge of the sofa, the towel still draped over her shoulders. The sweatshirt he'd given her was too big, the sleeves swallowing her hands, but it was warm, and the fabric smelled faintly of lavender. She folded the cuffs carefully, her small fingers smoothing the edges as though trying to avoid leaving any trace of herself behind. Paul watched her from across the room, leaning against the kitchen counter with a glass of water in hand. He didn't press her with questions. Instead, he observed her movements, the way she sat rigidly, her eyes darting around the room like she was cataloguing exits. He could see the wariness in her, the way she braced herself against even the smallest kindness. "You're safe here," he said finally, breaking the silence. "No one's going to bother you." She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "You don't know that?" Her words weren't defiant, just matter of fact, as if she'd learned long ago not to believe in guarantees. Paul nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in them. "I'll do my best," he said simply. The door slammed open, startling them both. A woman in her late 40s strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Rachel. Her eyes landed on Janice immediately, narrowing in disapproval. "What is this?" she demanded, turning to Paul. "You brought a stranger into your home." "She's a kid," Paul replied, his tone even but firm. "She needed help." Rachel crossed her arms, her gaze sweeping over Janice like she was inspecting something broken. "And how do you know she's not playing you? People like her." "Rachel." Paul's voice cut through her words, sharp and unyielding. "Not tonight." Rachel huffed, but said nothing more. She cast one last glance at Janice before disappearing down the hall, her disapproval hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Janice let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Paul met her eyes, his expression apologetic but calm. "She won't bother you again," he said. Janice nodded, her fingers curling into the fabric of the sweatshirt. She didn't trust him, not fully, but the warmth of the room and his quiet assurance made her wonder if maybe, just for tonight, she could rest. The morning sunlight seeped through the apartment's tall windows, catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Janice stirred on the sofa, her fingers clutching the oversized sweatshirt Paul had given her. She blinked against the light, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The soft hum of conversation in another room reminded her where she was. Paul was in the kitchen, his voice low but firm. "Rachel, enough." "I'm just saying," Rachel replied, her tone clipped. "You can't trust her. These street kids are smart, Paul. They know how to play people like you." Janice sat up slowly, her ears straining to catch every word. Janice sensed the sharp and slicing mistrust in Rachel's voice. "She's a child, Rachel," Paul said. "Not some criminal mastermind." "And how do you know that?" Rachel countered. "How do you know she won't steal from you the moment your back is turned?" The words struck Janice deeply. She stood, her small frame tense, and crept toward the kitchen. She stopped just outside the doorway, staying out of sight, but close enough to hear. "She's a kid who needed help," Paul said, his voice growing firmer. "That's all." Rachel sighed, exasperated. "You always do this. You think you can fix things, save people. But you can't, Paul. You're just setting yourself up for disappointment." Janice retreated back to the living room, her chest tightening. She wasn't angry, not exactly. She was used to hearing things like that, words thrown at her like stones. But this time, they came with a sting she hadn't expected. She sank back onto the sofa, pulling her knees to her chest. A few minutes later, Paul walked in, his expression unreadable. He hesitated at the edge of the room, then sat down in the armchair opposite her. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice quieter now. "My sister... she can be a little intense." Janice didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the coffee table, where a small stack of magazines lay neatly arranged. She traced the edge of one with her finger, her thoughts swirling. Paul leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "She's wrong, you know," he said. "You don't have to prove anything to her, or to me." Janice's fingers stilled on the magazine. She looked up, meeting his eyes for a brief moment before glancing away. "I don't steal," she said softly. "I know," Paul replied. There was no hesitation, no doubt in his voice, and it startled her. Over the next few days, Janice began to settle into the apartment's rhythm. She stayed mostly in the living room, her movements quiet and careful, as if afraid to disturb the space. Paul noticed how she folded the blanket she used every morning, smoothing out the creases with meticulous precision. She always left the sofa exactly as she'd found it, even repositioning the throw pillows. Paul was working on his laptop at the dining table one evening when Janice unexpectedly interrupted. "I used to sleep in this alley," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "near 47th and 9th. It was behind a bakery, and sometimes the baker would leave out stale bread. Not much, but it was better than nothing." Paul paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't look at her, sensing that eye contact might make her retreat. "That must have been hard," he said carefully. Janice shrugged. "It wasn't the worst place." She hesitated, then added, "There were worse places." Paul closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." She didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease just a little. A week later, Rachel's simmering hostility finally reached its peak. It was early evening, and Paul had stepped out to take a call in the hallway. Janice was in the kitchen, cautiously exploring the contents of the fridge, when Rachel stormed in. "What are you doing?" Rachel demanded, her eyes narrowing. Janice froze, her hand hovering over a carton of milk. "Nothing," she said quickly. Rachel crossed her arms, her expression hard. "Don't lie to me. I'm missing a bracelet, a gold one. I know I left it on the counter yesterday, and now it's gone." Janice's heart sank. "I didn't take it," she said, her voice small but steady. "Really?" Rachel said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Because things like that don't just disappear." Paul walked in just as Rachel's voice rose. "What's going on?" he asked, his gaze shifting between the two of them. "She took my bracelet," Rachel said, jabbing a finger toward Janice. "I didn't," Janice insisted, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Her voice cracked, but she held her ground. Paul stepped between them, his expression darkening. "Enough," he said sharply. "Rachel, you have no proof of that." "She's been here for a week, Paul," Rachel shot back. "Open your eyes." "Rachel, go," Paul said, his voice firm. "Now." Rachel huffed and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking against the floor. Janice stood frozen, her chest heaving. Paul turned to her, his voice softening. "I believe you," he said. But the damage was done. That night, long after Paul had gone to bed, Janice slipped out of the apartment. As she ran, her heart heaving with humiliation and the chilly comfort of familiarity, the city lights blurred in her vision. She was back where she started, alone, but safe from judgment. The rain pelted against the car's windshield in relentless waves, obscuring the view of the streetlights and storefronts that blurred into indistinct streaks of light. Paul gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the leather. His heart hammered in his chest as he scanned the sidewalks, his thoughts racing. How long had she been gone? An hour? More? The cold, biting rain was unyielding, and the image of Janice, soaked and vulnerable, gnawed at him. He replayed their earlier conversation in his mind, her quiet resilience, the way she had folded her blanket every morning, as if leaving no trace of herself would make her more acceptable in his world. She didn't deserve this, he muttered under his breath. His headlights cut through the darkness, revealing puddles pooling on the uneven pavement and the occasional figure hurrying for shelter. He slowed as he neared the park, his gaze darting toward every shadowy corner and bench. Nothing. Paul's frustration grew, tinged with a desperation he hadn't felt in years. He could almost hear Rachel's voice in his head. "You think you can save her?" He clenched his jaw. This wasn't about saving anyone. It was about making sure she didn't become another ghost in his life. In an alley on the other side of town, Janice huddled beneath a broken awning, her knees drawn to her chest. The sweatshirt Paul had given her clung to her, heavy with rain. Her breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the cold air. She shivered violently, but her pride burned hotter than the cold that seeped into her bones. Rachel's accusation resonated sharply and cuttingly in her ears. She'd been here before, invisible and unwanted. People consistently held negative assumptions about her. It was safer to leave before they made her prove them right. Her stomach churned, empty and aching. The paper bag of leftovers she'd clung to was gone, left behind in her hurried escape. She pressed her forehead against her knees, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to will away the rising tide of hopelessness. Paul spotted her by sheer chance. His car idled at a red light, his gaze sweeping the alleyways as he debated which direction to take next. There, half obscured by a pile of broken crates and trash bags, was a small, hunched figure. He hit the hazards and leapt out, his shoes splashing through a growing puddle as he ran. "Janice!" Her head jerked up, eyes wide with fear and recognition. For a moment, she didn't move, frozen like a startled animal. Paul crouched in front of her, his face etched with concern. "It's me," he said, his voice softer now. "You're okay. I'm here." Janice stared at him, water dripping from her hair and pooling around her feet. "Why did you come?" she whispered. "Because you shouldn't be out here," Paul said firmly. "Not like this." Her lip trembled, but she quickly bit it to steady herself. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice cracking. "I know," Paul replied without hesitation. "I told you. I believe you." The words hovered in the air, a delicate lifeline. Slowly, Janice nodded. "Come on," he said, shrugging off his coat and draping it over her shoulders. "Let's get you out of this rain." Back at the car, Paul turned up the heat, glancing at her in the rearview mirror as she huddled in the back seat, wrapped in his coat. She stared out the window, her eyes distant, but her breathing had steadied. At a red light, he turned to check on her again. She shifted slightly, and the sweatshirt she wore pulled up just enough to reveal her abdomen. Paul's eyes caught on the faint outline of a birthmark, visible even in the dim light. A distinct, fish-shaped mark he would have recognized anywhere. His breath caught in his throat. Memories flooded back with sharp clarity, Charlotte laughing as she pointed to the mark on their baby's belly, calling it their lucky fish. Pamela giggling as he tickled her tiny feet, her soft baby curls damp from a bath. He gripped the steering wheel, his mind spinning. It couldn't be. He shook his head, focusing on the road, but the image of the birthmark burned in his mind. When they reached the apartment, Paul carried Janice inside, her weight light against him. She didn't protest, too exhausted to argue. He laid her gently on the sofa, tucking a blanket around her as she drifted into a restless sleep. Paul sat in the armchair across from her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His gaze fell on her small figure, the sweatshirt swallowing her frame. The resemblance was undeniable now. Her features, the mark, even the way she curled into herself when she felt vulnerable. For the first time in years, hope sparked in his chest. Could it really be her? Could Janice be the daughter he had mourned for so long? He leaned back, the rain still pattering against the windows, and stared into the quiet room. The questions swirled, but one thought rose above them all. If she was Pamela, then he wasn't going to lose her again. The apartment was silent, except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Paul sat at the dining table, a mug of untouched coffee in front of him. His eyes drifted to the sofa where Janice slept, her small frame barely making an impression on the cushions. The blanket had shifted slightly in her sleep, exposing a corner of the sweatshirt, and beneath it, the faint outline of the fish-shaped birthmark. It couldn't be a coincidence. Paul's gaze lingered on her face. There was something hauntingly familiar in her features, the delicate curve of her jaw, the faint dimple that appeared when she frowned, even in sleep. It wasn't just resemblance. It was instinct, a pull in his chest that defied logic. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. He'd spent 8 years burying his grief for Pamela. He couldn't let himself hope. Not yet. The next morning, Janice stirred, blinking against the soft light filtering through the windows. Paul had already set a small breakfast on the kitchen counter: toast, a boiled egg, and a glass of orange juice. She hesitated, standing at the edge of the room as though unsure if she was allowed to take it. "It's for you," Paul said, noticing her hesitation. Janice nodded and sat down, her movements careful and measured. She ate in silence, her eyes darting occasionally to him. "You slept okay?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She shrugged. It was warm. Paul took a sip of his coffee, watching her carefully. "I was thinking," he began, "maybe today we could talk a bit. Just you and me." Her eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering in them. "About what?" "Whatever you want," Paul said with a small shrug. "I'd just like to know more about you." Janice set her fork down, her posture stiffening. "Why?" Paul leaned back, his voice gentle. "Because you matter, and I think it's important for you to feel like someone cares about what you've been through." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "What do you want to know?" Over the next hour, Janice spoke in fragments, her words halting and careful. She told him about the orphanage, how the caregivers there were strict and cold, treating the children more like inconveniences than people. "They didn't hit us all the time," she said, her voice flat. "Just when they thought we deserved it." Paul's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I ran away when I was 7, she continued, her gaze fixed on the table. "It was bad, but the streets were better. At least out there, no one told me I wasn't worth anything." Her words hung heavy in the air. Paul fought the urge to ask more, to press her for details about how she had survived. Instead, he nodded. "That must have been hard," he said. Janice glanced at him, her eyes searching his face for judgment or pity. Finding none, she nodded once. That night, Paul sat at his desk, a file open before him. The paper inside was an old medical record, Pamela's birth certificate. He ran his finger over the printed words, stopping at the line that described the distinctive birthmark. He'd spent hours going over every detail he could remember about his daughter, matching them to what he now saw in Janice. The timelines coincided flawlessly, with Janice's story fitting seamlessly into the years Pamela had been absent. But what if he was wrong? The thought gnawed at him, the fear of hoping too soon. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment, not when Janice had already been through so much. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Dr. Morgan," he said when the call connected. "It's Paul Rowan. I need a favor." 2 days later, Paul watched as a lab technician carefully sealed a DNA sample in a sterile bag. He had sampled a strand of Janice's hair while she slept, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his chest. The technician promised results in a week that felt like a lifetime. Waiting is not pleasant for anyone. So while you wait for the next part of the story, why don't you leave some intriguing comments below, like the name of your favorite food or the name of your pet? We would love to hear about it. Paul returned home to find Janice sitting on the floor by the coffee table, drawing with a pencil she'd found in the kitchen. She didn't look up as he entered, her focus entirely on the sketch in front of her. "What are you working on?" he asked, crouching beside her. Janice hesitated, then tilted the paper toward him. It was a simple drawing of a house with a small figure standing outside, holding hands with a taller one. Paul studied the picture, his throat tightening. "Is this you?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I used to have a house," she said quietly. "Before everything. I don't really remember it, but sometimes I dream about it." Paul swallowed hard, his hand hovering over her shoulder before settling there lightly. "Dreams are important," he said. "Sometimes they help us find things we've lost." Janice looked at him then, her expression softer, more open than he'd seen before. "Do you think so?" Paul nodded. "I do." Inside, he held onto his own dream, the faint, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, the daughter he thought he'd lost forever was sitting right in front of him. The envelope sat on Paul's desk, stark and unassuming. Its contents, however, carried the weight of years. He hadn't opened it yet, his hands resting on the edge of the desk as he stared at the printed label. Confidential. DNA results. His breath was steady, deliberate, as though he could will himself to stay calm, to prepare for either outcome. Slowly he reached for the envelope and tore it open, his fingers careful, almost reverent. The folded sheet of paper inside felt heavier than it should. He unfolded it and scanned the lines, his eyes landing on the words that would either confirm or shatter the fragile hope he'd held onto for the past week. 99.9%. Probability of biological relationship. For a moment, the world went silent. Paul's chest tightened, and he pressed the paper against the desk, his head lowering as emotions surged through him. Relief washed over him first, followed by an overwhelming wave of joy and grief intertwined. Pamela. She was alive. His mind raced with images of the little girl he'd lost and the quiet, guarded child who now slept in his home. He thought of all the years she had endured alone, her resilience carved out of necessity, her laughter stolen by circumstances she never should have faced. And yet, she was here. Paul sat with the results for a long time, his thoughts running in endless circles. Telling Janice the truth now felt too sudden, too overwhelming. She carried so much already. Would she even believe him? And what if the revelation unraveled the fragile sense of stability she was beginning to feel? He folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. His priority was clear. He needed to understand what had happened to Pamela all those years ago. That evening, Paul sat down with his laptop, pulling up the hospital records he'd been able to access with the help of his lawyer. The documents were incomplete, but they told part of the story. Charlotte, his wife, had died upon arrival due to the accident. Pamela, then just a baby, had been listed as critically injured but alive when admitted. A note in the discharge section read, "Deceased, cause, trauma complications." The words felt like a dagger, twisting the fresh wound of his guilt, but something about them didn't sit right. Paul leaned forward, reading through the nurse's notes and discharge forms. The handwriting was hurried, the details sparse. The attending physician's signature didn't match the one on Pamela's original admission papers. His lawyer's investigation had also uncovered inconsistencies. Records indicated that a nurse, Jessica Hayes, had been working the night of the accident, but her employment abruptly ended a week later. There were no follow-up reports, no autopsy, no burial records for Pamela. Nothing to confirm that she had actually died. Paul's stomach turned. Someone had orchestrated this. The next morning, Paul sat across from Janice at the breakfast table, his expression calm despite the storm of thoughts swirling inside him. She was eating slowly, her small hands steady as she cut into a piece of toast. "Do you remember much about when you were little?" he asked, his tone casual. Janice glanced up, her fork pausing mid-air. "Not really," she said, shrugging. "I was at the orphanage for as long as I can remember." "Do you know how you got there?" She shook her head. "The people there never told me. I think they didn't care." Her voice was flat, but Paul could sense the pain beneath her words. He leaned forward slightly. "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here to listen." Janice gave him a small nod, but she didn't say anything more. Later that day, Paul reached out to his lawyer again. "I need to find this nurse, Jessica Hayes," he said firmly. "She's the missing piece." "Already working on it," the lawyer replied. "I should have something for you by tomorrow." Paul ended the call and stared out the window, the city stretching out below him. The thought of someone deliberately taking Pamela from him reignited his fury. He had spent 8 years grieving her loss, only to find that it had been a lie. That evening, Paul watched Janice as she sketched in her notebook. She seemed calmer than when she had first arrived, her shoulders less tense, her movements more relaxed. "What are you drawing this time?" he asked, sitting beside her. She tilted the paper toward him. It was another house, this one more detailed than the last. 2 figures stood in front of it, a child and an adult, their hands joined. "That's you and me," she said quietly, surprising him. Paul's breath caught. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Janice hesitated, then added, "Do you think, one day, I'll have a real home like this?" Paul swallowed hard, nodding. "I think you already do," he said softly. As she smiled faintly and returned to her drawing, Paul silently vowed that he would uncover the truth, not just for himself, but for her. She deserved to know who she was, where she came from, and that she had never truly been forgotten. Whatever it took, Paul would make sure she never felt alone again. The lawyer's voice was crisp over the phone the next morning. "We found her, Jessica Hayes. She's been living upstate in a small town outside Albany. I've already contacted a private investigator who's gathering more details on her involvement." Paul leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as he processed the information. "Does she know you found her?" he asked. "No," the lawyer replied. "We're keeping it discreet until we have enough evidence to confront her." "Good," Paul said, his voice tight. "I want to know everything." By the end of the week, Paul had a thick file in front of him, courtesy of the investigator. It contained records of Jessica's employment, her abrupt resignation, and financial inconsistencies that coincided suspiciously with Rachel's accounts. The most damning piece, however, was a sworn statement from a former co-worker at the hospital. The nurse, who had been hesitant to come forward, eventually admitted she'd overheard Jessica discussing arrangements with a family member of a patient, Rachel. Paul clenched his fists as he read the report. The puzzle was coming together, portraying a picture of betrayal. Rachel had orchestrated the entire deception, using Jessica to fake Pamela's death and ensure her removal to an orphanage, far away from Paul's life. 2 days later, Paul sat across from Jessica Hayes, in a dimly lit cafe. She was older now, her hair streaked with grey, but her eyes darted nervously, the guilt practically radiating from her. "You know why I'm here?" Paul began, his voice steady, but cold. Jessica nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred her coffee. "I didn't want to do it," she said quickly. "But your sister, she made it impossible to refuse." Paul leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me everything." Jessica took a deep breath, avoiding his gaze. After the accident, Pamela was admitted to the ICU. She was stable, hurt, but stable. I was on shift when your sister came in. She said the child's survival complicated things and offered me money to change the records. She wanted the hospital to list Pamela as deceased. Paul's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just below the surface. "And you agreed?" Jessica flinched at the accusation. "I needed the money," she whispered. "She paid me to discharge Pamela under a false name and deliver her to an orphanage. I didn't know what would happen after that." Paul's voice was sharp. "Do you understand what you did? You took my child from me. You let her grow up thinking she was alone." Tears welled in Jessica's eyes, but Paul didn't waver. "Why didn't you come forward?" he demanded. "I was scared," she admitted. "Rachel warned me that if I said anything, she'd ruin me, and she had the resources to do it." Paul stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He threw some cash onto the table, his fury barely contained. "You should be scared now," he said, "because this isn't over." Back at the apartment, Paul paced the living room, his thoughts swirling with anger and disbelief. Janice was in her room, quietly drawing, unaware of the storm brewing around her. Paul grabbed the phone and dialed Rachel's number, his hand shaking as he pressed it to his ear. The call went straight to voicemail. He slammed the phone onto the counter, his frustration spilling over. Rachel had taken everything from him, his wife, his daughter, years of memories that could never be reclaimed. And for what? Greed? Power? That night, as Paul tucked Janice into bed, she looked up at him with worn eyes. "You look angry," she said softly. Paul paused, his heart aching at her perceptiveness. "Not at you," he assured her. "Never at you." Janice nodded, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "Good," she murmured, before drifting off to sleep. Paul sat by her bedside for a long time, watching her breathe. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on his chest, but he knew he couldn't tell her yet, not until he confronted Rachel and made sure Janice was safe from the past. He rose quietly and walked back to his desk, opening the file again. His resolve hardened. Rachel had stolen 8 years from him and Pamela, and now it was time to take them back. He would confront her, expose her lies, and ensure she could never hurt his family again. Whatever it took, he would make sure Janice, his Pamela, finally knew the truth. The office door opened with a slow creak, and Rachel stood in the doorway, her expression frozen between irritation and apprehension. She hadn't been expecting Paul. The late afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the entryway, accentuating the tension in her clenched jaw. "What are you doing here, Paul?" she asked, her voice clipped. "We need to talk," Paul said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The determination in his eyes left no room for argument. Rachel shut the door, turning to face him with her arms crossed. "If this is about that girl, It's not just about her," Paul interrupted, his voice sharp. "It's about what you did, what you've been hiding for the past 8 years. Rachel's posture stiffened, but she kept her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." Paul dropped a thick file onto the dining table, the sound echoing through the room. "Don't play dumb. I've pieced it all together. Jessica Hayes, the hospital records, The money transfers. I know everything, Rachel. For a moment, Rachel's face remained stoic, but then her shoulders sagged. She turned away, her fingers gripping the back of a chair, as if it could anchor her. I had no choice, she said, quietly. Paul's voice rose, his anger finally breaking free. No choice? You had every choice. You took my daughter from me. You deceived. You fabricated her death, and you abandoned her in an orphanage, as if she were worthless. Rachel whirled around, her eyes blazing. Do you think I wanted to do it? She snapped. Do you think it was straightforward for me? Paul's laugh was bitter, almost mocking. Easy for you. Rachel, you destroyed my life. You destroyed hers. And for what? Money? Control? Because I was nothing, Rachel shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of years of resentment. Because you were always the favorite. Dad gave you everything. The company, the inheritance, the attention. I was just the afterthought. The spinster sister with nothing to her name. Paul stared at her, his anger momentarily tempered by the raw pain in her voice. So you punished me. You punished a child for Dad's mistakes. Rachel's lips trembled, but she pressed on, her tone defensive. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I thought she'd be adopted by a loving family. I thought it would be better for her. And for me. Paul's jaw tightened. You thought wrong. She wasn't adopted. She was abandoned, neglected, and forced to survive on the streets. She's been through hell because of you. Rachel looked away, guilt flickering across her face. I didn't know. I never checked. You never checked because you didn't care, Paul said coldly. You only cared about keeping me in the dark and securing your place in the family. Rachel's silence was deafening. Paul stepped closer, his voice low but cutting. That girl you've been sneering at, the one you accused of stealing, that's Pamela, my daughter, your niece. Rachel's eyes widened, and she stumbled back as if he'd struck her. No, that's not possible. It is, Paul said firmly. I had a DNA test done. She's Pamela. Rachel sank into a chair, her hands trembling. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Paul leaned over the table, his fury undiminished. That doesn't absolve you. Nothing will. But for Pamela's sake, I'm not going to drag this into the courts. I'm giving you one chance, Rachel. Take it. Rachel's head snapped up, her expression wary. What do you mean? I'll give you enough money to start over, Paul said. But you're leaving New York. You'll stay out of my life, and you'll stay far away from Pamela. If I ever see or hear from you again, I won't hesitate to make sure everyone knows exactly what you did. Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but stopped. The weight of her guilt and the inevitability of Paul's ultimatum pressed down on her. Slowly, she nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Fine, I'll go. Paul straightened, his voice steady but distant. Good. I'll have the money transferred to your account by tomorrow. Pack your things and be gone by the end of the week. Rachel didn't respond. She simply sat there, her face pale and drawn, as Paul walked to the door. He paused briefly, his hand on the doorknob. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I hope you find whatever it is you were looking for. But don't expect forgiveness. Without waiting for a reply, he stepped out into the fading light, the door clicking shut behind him. That evening, Paul returned home to find Janice curled up on the sofa, her sketchbook resting on her lap. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face. Are you okay? She asked. Paul sat beside her, his expression softening. I am now, he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Everything's going to be okay. Janice smiled faintly, and Paul felt a sense of peace settle over him for the first time in years. Rachel was gone, and the truth was finally out. Now, he could focus on what truly mattered, rebuilding the life he'd lost and giving Pamela the love and security she deserved. The next morning, Paul sat across from Janice at the breakfast table, his expression unusually contemplative. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind countless times, yet the words felt tangled, delicate, as though one wrong syllable could shatter the fragile trust they had built. "Janice," he began softly, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. She looked up from her cereal, her wide eyes locking onto his. "There's something I need to tell you. Something important." Janice paused, her spoon mid-air. "What is it?" she asked cautiously, her tone guarded. Paul leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Do you remember when I asked about your past? About where you came from?" Janice nodded, her expression curious but wary. Paul exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "The first time I saw you, on the street, I noticed something about you. A birthmark." He gestured lightly toward his own stomach. "A fish-shaped one, right here." Janice blinked, her hand instinctively moving to her abdomen. "How did you know that?" Paul's voice grew quieter, more intense. "Because my daughter, Pamela, had the same birthmark. It's something I'll never forget." Janice froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "Your daughter," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "Janice, Pamela, you're my daughter. I know it's challenging to believe, but I've been searching for answers ever since I lost you. And when I found you, everything started to make sense." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion. How do you know it's me? How can you be sure?" "I had a DNA test done," Paul admitted, his voice unwavering. "It confirmed what I already knew in my heart. You're Pamela." Janice pulled her hand away, her breathing shallow. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you say anything?" "I didn't want to overwhelm you," Paul said gently. "You've been through so much already. I needed to make sure you were ready to hear it. And I needed to make certain that I could protect you." Janice's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know," she murmured, shaking her head. "I don't know if I can believe this. It's too much." "I understand," Paul said, his tone patient and understanding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photo. "This is your mother, Charlotte. My wife." He slid the photo across the table. It was worn but clear, a smiling woman holding a baby with soft curls. Janice picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the image. The woman's warmth felt oddly familiar, like a distant memory surfacing. "She used to call you her lucky fish," Paul said, his voice soft, "because of the birthmark. She said it was a sign you'd bring joy to everyone around you." Janice's tears fell freely now, and she didn't bother to hide them. "I don't remember her," she whispered. "I don't remember any of it." Paul's heart ached, but he smiled gently. "That's okay. We will proceed incrementally. You don't have to remember everything right away, but I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. You never were." The following weeks were filled with quiet moments of rebuilding. Paul took Janice to a nearby park, where they sat on a bench and talked about her dreams, her fears, and her favorite sketches. He encouraged her to explore her love of drawing, buying her a set of art supplies and praising every creation she showed him. He also enrolled her in school, a small, nurturing environment where she could make friends and feel safe. The first day, Janice clung to his hand, her nervousness palpable. But by the end of the week, she came home with a tentative smile, sharing stories about her classmates and the kind teacher who had praised her artwork. In the evenings, they cooked together, simple meals that turned into moments of laughter as Janice learned to navigate the kitchen. Paul cherished every small victory. Her first genuine laugh, the way she began to relax around him, and the way she started calling him Dad in hesitant but meaningful moments. One night, as they sat on the living room floor, surrounded by her sketches, Janice looked up at him, her expression serious. "Do you think Mum would have liked these?" she asked, holding up a drawing of a house with flowers lining the walkway. Paul's chest tightened, but he smiled. "She would have loved them," he said. "She always said you had a creative spark, even as a baby." Janice smiled faintly, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I think I want to keep drawing," she said. Maybe I could be an artist one day." "You can be anything you want," Paul said firmly, "and I'll be here every step of the way." Janice leaned against his shoulder, her small frame fitting perfectly into the crook of his arm. For the first time in years, Paul felt whole. The road ahead would still have challenges, but he knew they could face them together. As he looked down at his daughter, her eyes heavy with sleep, but her heart finally at ease, Paul whispered a silent promise. "You're home now, and I'll never let you go again." The late afternoon sun bathed the cemetery in a soft golden light, casting long shadows over the rows of weathered headstones. Paul parked the car at the edge of the small, secluded cemetery and stepped out, holding the door open for Janice. She hesitated, her fingers clutching the edge of her sketchbook. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of uncertainty. Paul crouched to meet her eyes, his expression warm and steady. "It's okay to be nervous, but this is important, for both of us." Janice nodded, slowly, stepping out of the car. Together, they walked down the gravel path, the crunch of their footsteps blending with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Paul carried a small bouquet of white lilies, their fragrance faint but calming. They stopped in front of a simple headstone engraved with Charlotte's name. Below it, the words, "Beloved wife and mother," were etched delicately into the stone. Paul stared at it for a moment, the weight of loss pressing on his chest. "Hi, Charlotte," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been a long time." Janice stood silently beside him, her hands gripping the sketchbook tightly. She looked at the headstone, then at Paul, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and sadness. Paul placed the lilies gently at the base of the grave. "I promised to see you once," he continued, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "To take care of our daughter, no matter what. I failed you for so long, but I'm here now, and I'll spend the rest of my life keeping that promise." Janice's grip on her sketchbook loosened, and she stepped closer to the grave. Her eyes lingered on the name, etched in stone, as if trying to connect the person in the photo Paul had shown her with the mother she never remembered. "She would have loved you," Paul said, his voice breaking slightly. "She always said you were her little miracle." Janice looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Do you think she knows that we found each other?" Paul smiled gently. "I think she does. And I think she's watching over us right now." Janice knelt down, opening her sketchbook. She carefully tore out a page, a drawing she had spent hours on the night before. It showed a simple, heartwarming scene. Paul, Charlotte, and herself standing together in front of a house, their hands joined. She placed the drawing at the base of the headstone, next to the lilies. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, as she said, "Thank you, Mum, for keeping us together." Paul swallowed hard, his heart swelling with pride and love for his daughter. He rested a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the cemetery. Paul and Janice stood together in silence, the quiet moment a tribute to the family they had been and the family they were becoming. After a while, Paul turned to Janice. "Ready to go?" She nodded, slipping her hand into his. They walked back toward the car, the golden light wrapping around them like a promise of hope and healing. As they reached the car, Janice looked up at Paul, her expression calm, but thoughtful. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" Paul stopped, kneeling so he was at eye level with her. "Janice, Pamela," he said softly. "She would be more than proud. She would be amazed at how strong, kind, and talented you are. And I'm proud of you too, every single day." Janice's face broke into a shy smile, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. "I'm glad I found you," she said quietly. Paul's throat tightened, but he managed to smile. "I'm glad I found you too." They climbed into the car, and as Paul started the engine, the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating their path. For the first time in years, Paul felt at peace, and Janice felt something she had long thought impossible: a sense of belonging. Together they drove away, leaving the cemetery behind, but carrying Charlotte's memory with them, a guiding light as they embraced their future as a family. The journey ahead would not be without challenges, but for the first time, both Paul and Janice were ready to face it together, with love as their foundation and hope as their compass. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.